This is going to make some American politicians upset. Today, OPEC made the surprise decision to cut its oil production by 1.1 million barrels per day, which is a complete reversal from what Saudi Arabia's energy minister said only weeks ago. The agreement that we struck in October is here to stay for the rest of the year, period, Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman said on February 14th. The prince was referring to an agreement that the group known as OPEC Plus made in October to cut oil production by 2 million barrels per day. That decision sparked outrage among U.S. politicians who accused Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other major oil producers of supporting Russia in its war against Ukraine. There's going to be some consequences for what they've done with Russia, President Biden said at the time. Biden was upset that OPEC had agreed to cut oil production at a time in which the U.S. and its allies were facing record high energy prices, and when they were trying to choke Russia off from money that it could use to fund its war in Ukraine. Russia is one of the two largest oil exporters in the world, along with Saudi Arabia. It relies on oil and gas sales to fund nearly half of its federal budget. Now, historically, Russia hasn't been a member of OPEC, but it started to coordinate with the group in 2016. When Russia acts in concert with OPEC, people call the broader group OPEC Plus. So to U.S. politicians, when OPEC Plus decided to cut oil production by 2 million barrels per day back in October, it looked like Saudi Arabia and other OPEC members were helping Russia in working against the U.S. and its interests in Ukraine. They were trying to prop up oil prices, which directly benefits Russia. But that decision, as well as today's decision to cut oil production by another million barrels per day, might not be as nefarious as they seem. After all, OPEC has been making decisions to adjust its oil production for decades. That's the whole point of the organization. It's what economists call a cartel. In theory, by working together, members of OPEC can reduce their oil supply by a certain percentage, leading to an even bigger percentage increase in the price of oil. As a result, they make more money than if they didn't work together to limit supply. Theoretically, this sounds like a good idea, but in reality, OPEC hasn't been an effective cartel because its members end up cheating on each other. Members say that they'll cut their production by a certain amount, but they don't follow through and do it. They secretly pump every barrel of oil that they can and hope that other members cut their supply. Since there's no way for the cartel to enforce its quotas, there's no consequences for the cheating. And in the end, almost every member ends up selling every barrel of oil that it can. The only members who seem to consistently follow through on their pledges is Saudi Arabia, which makes sense since it has the most to gain or lose from changes in oil prices, as well as its neighbor, the United Arab Emirates. Since the date of that announced oil production cut, oil prices have fallen from $93 a barrel to less than $80 per barrel. So this is the perfect illustration of the fact that OPEC isn't a very effective cartel. But even so, the fact that OPEC is coordinating with Russia at a time in which Russia is on really bad terms with the US adds an element of political sensitivity to recent OPEC decisions, even though these decisions have been quietly happening for years and years without incident. Additionally, the recent strain in the relationship between the US and OPEC's top oil producer, Saudi Arabia, adds further scrutiny to these decisions. Personally, outside of the rare cases when oil prices are really high or really low, I don't think OPEC's decisions are all that consequential. Oil prices today are around $80 per barrel, which is the same as they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and 15 years ago. And if you look at the price of oil on an inflation-adjusted basis, it's right around the 40-year average. So based on the evidence, OPEC just isn't a big factor in driving long-term oil prices. But as I've been saying, the shifting geopolitical picture colors how the US views OPEC's actions. And for better or for worse, at some point we might see retaliation by the US. Remember, President Biden threatened consequences for OPEC back in October. So far, we haven't seen him actually do anything. But if push came to shove and Biden or some other US president wanted to retaliate against OPEC, there's one bazooka that they could use. It's called NOPEC, a bill that would open OPEC member countries up to lawsuits for violating US antitrust laws. Remember how I mentioned that OPEC is a cartel? Well, cartels are illegal in most countries. In the US, the Sherman Antitrust Act prohibits anti-competitive practices that attempt to restrain trade and commerce, something that OPEC clearly tries to do by limiting oil production. But currently, OPEC member countries have sovereign immunity from US lawsuits, which means that they can't be sued in US courts. The NOPEC bill would remove that immunity, opening OPEC member countries up to lawsuits from the Department of Justice. Proponents of the bill argue that OPEC member countries shouldn't be allowed to get together and collude in an attempt to restrict oil supplies and raise oil prices. They believe that the threat of lawsuits will lead to increased oil supplies as the oil-producing countries that are restricting their oil production, like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, would be compelled to release all of that oil onto the market. But there are many opponents of the NOPEC bill as well. As OPEC itself argues, the NOPEC bill could cause more volatility in oil prices by reducing the ability of OPEC countries to smooth out oil price fluctuations by increasing production when oil prices are high and reducing production when oil prices are low. Others believe that the bill would severely damage diplomatic relations between the US and OPEC oil-producing countries, potentially leading to economic blowback on America. With the threat of lawsuits hanging over them, oil-producing countries could reduce their investments in American assets, fearing that those assets could be seized as part of any legal judgment against them. American companies' overseas assets could also be at risk if there's retaliation. And America's geopolitical interests in Africa and the Middle East, where many OPEC member countries reside, could also be hurt by the passing of this bill. As the Baker Institute points out, for many of these oil-producing nations, oil is an existential economic priority and in some cases underpins the survival of ruling families, while for the US, it's only one of many competing priorities. In other words, the NOPEC bill could introduce a lot of problems for the US in exchange for very little upside. That's probably why the NOPEC bill has never been signed into law despite being introduced to Congress so many times over the past 23 years. The closest it got was in 2007 when the bill easily passed both chambers of Congress but then failed to become law when President George W. Bush threatened to veto it. You never know what could happen, but I find it hard to believe that the NOPEC bill will pass this year if it didn't pass last year when oil prices were much higher and the Russia-Ukraine war was more of a front-page story than it is today. It feels like a bill like this has the greatest chance of passing when oil prices are really high and politicians are looking for someone to blame for those high prices. That's not the case today, but one day we could get the perfect storm that causes a US president to support this bill and sign it into law. We'll see what happens. Follow for more insights on the economy and investing.